The hostile attitude of Britain's civil society to homosexuality, one heightened in the aftermath of the Oscar Wilde trial, was not just duplicated in the Royal Navy, it was taken to an even greater degree of severity. The Navy, as an all-male fighting force that privileged certain categories of manliness and relied upon the close camaraderie of its all-male crews to provide the necessary group cohesion in battle, regarded same-sex desire as a particular threat both to its martial ethos and to its much-prized close-order efficiency. As a result, the naval authorities had traditionally adopted an even more stringent line than the civil ones when it came to punishing homosexual behaviour. Throughout the 18th century, right through to the start of the 19th century, sailors unfortunate enough to be found guilty of so-called unnatural crimes could expect harsh sentences. Several hundred lashes could easily be the penalty for even minor acts of indecency, while death by hanging was not uncommon for the most serious infractions. Even by mid-century, after considerable reform of the legal system, extended prison sentences remained the normal prescribed punishment. For such punishments to be handed down, however, sailors engaging in consensual homoerotic encounters had first to be apprehended and then successfully tried by court-martial. In the late Victorian Navy, this was anything but frequent. Prosecutions for sodomy, the most serious of all homosexual crimes, were extremely rare, while actual convictions were scarcer still. Indeed, so infrequent were they that when in March 1902 Walter Cannell, an able seaman from HMS Northumberland, tender to HMS Pembroke, and William John Vincent, a stoker, second class from the same ship, were found guilty of sodomy, it led to the revelation that the Navy's official sentencing guidelines for such offences against morality were not only over a decade out of date, but had actually fallen significantly out of line with the nation's formally constituted legal code. This became evident when, as was routine, the transcripts of the trial of Cannell and Vincent were sent to the Admiralty after the court had risen for confirmation of sentence. In most cases, this was with a view to having the sentence formally ratified, but in this instance, the court was actually requesting a reduction in one of the penalties they had laid down. The officers who had passed judgment on Vincent believed that he deserved a measure of leniency on account of his youth — he was 18 years old — and naivety, but had felt unable to grant this themselves, and had instead, somewhat reluctantly, imposed 10 years' penal servitude upon him. The reason for this long term of imprisonment was that the court had been guided in its sentencing decision by the latest edition of the Admiralty Memorandum on Court-Martial Procedure, a crucial document that, in the relevant section, clearly stated that 10 years was the minimum penalty that could be imposed for this category of offence. In deferring to this instruction, despite their misgivings, the officers of the court were, of course, acting quite properly. The Admiralty Memorandum on Court-Martial Procedure was, as its name implied, intended to be the definitive reference point on all aspects of the court-martial process. To this end, it was frequently revised, with new editions coming out at regular intervals to reflect changes in British legal codes and jurisprudence. The iteration used by the court had been issued only the year before, in 1901. As was customary, considerable trouble had been taken in compiling it, the various drafts having been vetted on several occasions prior to printing both by the Treasury Solicitor and by the Judge Advocate of the Fleet. However, despite such extensive and high-level scrutiny, it transpired that the document was not as definitive as had been intended. On the contrary, there was, in fact, a significant error in regard to punishing the crime of sodomy, namely that no account had been taken of the Penal Servitude Act of 1891, a major piece of reforming legislation that, among many provisions, had reduced the minimum sentence for sodomy from 10 years to 3. As a result, the Admiralty Memorandum on Court-Martial Procedure offered misleading and inaccurate guidance on this point. The proceeding of the Cannell-Vincent court-martial and the 10-year sentences handed down, despite the fact that the court wanted a lesser punishment in Vincent's case, shone a bright light on this omission, and an amendment to the memorandum incorporating the provisions of the Penal Servitude Act of 1891 was hurriedly issued to the fleet.